Review at the New York State Military Museum and Veterans Research Center, Saratoga Springs, New York. It is November 21st, 2002, approximately 10:45. The interviewer is Michael Russert. Would you give me your full name, your date of birth and place of birth, please?
My name is John Charles Rucigay. I was born on January 25th, 1925 in the Queens section of New York City, Ridgewood, New York.
What was your pre-military service education?
I went through high school, graduated from vocational high school as an aircraft mechanic.
And could you tell me where you were when you heard about Pearl Harbor and your reaction?
Yeah, actually I was with my folks. We went to a Sunday dance. Actually it was a kind of a gathering, if you will, at a place called the Polish National Home on 8th Street in Manhattan. And I remember the scene there. It was a big hall called Arlington Hall. I remember the scene there. It was in the early afternoon time period when I first heard about Pearl Harbor. And my reaction was, I guess, fear and anger combined, whatever, etc., that we would be at war. Even though the clouds of war were rolling in Europe naturally for a few years, I suspected we might be getting in one way or another, but that was a surprise for all of us.
Mm-hmm. Did you enlist or were you drafted?
Actually, I enlisted, but it was called Voluntary Induction. At that time, I just turned 18 when they closed all the voluntary enlistments down, so I had to wait until they allowed us to volunteer, if you will. And I waited when they opened up the voluntary induction again. It was a couple of months after I was 18. And I went down and took the cadet program examinations, both physical and written, and passed all the tests and got sworn in on April 8th of '43, as I recall. And then they asked, how soon do you want to leave? And I heard, this was the aviation pilot training program in the Army. I heard that if you said immediately that you could bypass all of the college training and flying in Piper Cubs and that nature. So I said as soon as possible. And that led to me being on a troop train 3 days later. So I left New York City as a civilian, sworn in to Nashville, Tennessee, where I received all the examinations and shots and uniforms and everything else, and we started pre-flight school, then primary, basic, and advanced flying schools.
Can I go back a second? Why did you pick the Army Air Corps?
Well, I was always interested in the Army Air Corps for years and years, and then a buddy of mine joined the Navy Air Corps, so I thought I might go into the Navy Air Corps. But then, for some reason or other, the Army Air Corps opened this opportunity, and I took it. Yes. I was always a fan of the Army Air Corps anyways. Yeah.
Had you ever flown?
I'd flown the first time when I was 13 years old out of Roosevelt Field in an open biplane with a family friend. And it was an interesting experience because I thought I knew everything about flying by then. I was only 13 years old, reading magazines. But lo and behold, we were airborne and landed before I knew where we were.
Okay, I'm sorry, would you continue with where you did your training?
Oh, well, we went from Nashville Classification Center to Montgomery, Alabama, Maxwell Field. That was for 2 months of pre-flight training, where we had 1 month being an underclassman and 1 month being an upperclassman, if you will. Mm-hmm. And we had all the traditions of West Point as far as eating square meals and things of that nature, and hitting the rat line when you're underclassman. You can't walk anywhere freely, whatever. And then after 2 months, we went to primary flight school, which was in Clarksdale, Mississippi, which is about 75 miles south of Memphis on the Mississippi River, and flew Stearman biplanes. There was an open cockpit, primary trainers, and soloed there. And then after 2 months, we advanced to basic flying school, which was in Cortland, Alabama. We flew a Vultee BT-13s. They're a low-wing 450 horsepower aircraft engine. After 2 months, we went to advanced school, even though I wanted to become a fighter pilot. By that time, they needed a lot of bomber pilots, apparently. So I'd say 90% of the class went to twin-engine flight school, which I did in Freeman Field, Seymour, Indiana. And that was 2 months of flying there. And then graduated on January 7th of 44, 3 weeks before I was 19, as a second lieutenant with wings. So then from that point on, we were given a little leave for the first time. So I got back to see my family for a few weeks. And then I was assigned to, I forget what they called it, placement itself, but it was in Salt Lake City, is where it was a pool like for all bombardiers, navigators, airmen, of sorts, pilots, and so on. And we formed bomb crews there, but we didn't do any training as crews. It was just kind of a gathering place. And then we were assigned to a crew which we collectively went down to Tucson, Arizona, Davis Monthan Field. And we trained as a flight crew from that time period, which was February, March, April, basically. And then we were assigned to go to the 15th Air Force after we picked up our airplane in Topeka, Kansas, a B-24 model. And that was about the early part of May, and took us just about 2 weeks to fly down through Florida, Puerto Rico, Borinquen Field, in Guyana, one of the Guianas, then 2 stops in Brazil before we took off from Fortaleza, Brazil, across the ocean into Dakar, Africa. That was a little over 12-hour trip. And then proceeded from there up, made a landing at Marrakesh, Africa, and refueled there, went to, to Tindouf, Africa, in the middle of the Sahara Desert. And then from there we went to Marrakesh, Africa, and then made another stop before we went over to Italy, and we joined with what we called our bomb group from that point on. And that was called Gioia del Colle. It was near Bari, Italy at the time. This is in, at that time period was in end of May of 44. Yeah. We flew our first mission on May 25th, actually. Then continued flying missions every few days, depending on what the situation was relative to weather. We also had an engine change out, which we didn't fly for a whole week. And completed 16 actual flights, credited with about 25 missions, because they had single missions and double missions, if you will. So if the harder the target, the higher the rating, and we got double credit for it. Like Ploesti was a double credit, and we went there at least 2 times. And then finally on 19th of July of 44, we went to Munich, and we had trouble before we even formed up with a group, but we decided to stay with them, and an electrical system went out. One engine went out. We were halfway to the target. We debated whether we should turn back and go home, but we felt we were too close. We were at 15,000 feet or so. We couldn't climb any higher, and the group was climbing much higher than us, of course, for the bomb run. So we stayed with them at our altitude. We couldn't climb because we only had 3 engines then. We experienced flak difficulty and more problems over the target. We had another engine go out on us. We had 2 engines left then. They were on one side. We had an electrical system, like I said, we had no flight controls at all. We didn't have any communication with anybody in the air or amongst ourselves in the intercom, because our electrical system was out, and navigational aids were out basically, and we just flew by over the Alps, by the way, on the way home, until we came across the northern Italian Adriatic border, proceeded further south, hopefully aiming toward getting to our home base. And fortunately, in some respects, the 3rd engine went out just as we cleared the last tip of land on the east coast of the Adriatic. So we swung in toward that east coast of the Adriatic, and started to bail out once we crossed over land. And even though we had no electrical communication, we had 5 of the people, and there were 10 people in our crew. 5 of them were in the back end of the airplane, and 5 in the front end. And on hand signals, we started jumping out one after another. And I was in the front end, second to last. The pilot was last. And about 10,000 feet is when I bailed out. And I had a chest pack, a backpack, I should say, pilot and co-pilot. I was a co-pilot. We wore backpacks. The rest of the crew had chest packs where they clipped on the chute to the harness and proceeded down toward the ground. And it took, it seemed like forever to get down, I guess 15 minutes or so at least. And finally, because of our integration with the people that jumped out the tail, the last man to jump out the tail actually landed before I did, almost underneath me. And so I landed about 25, 30 feet away from him. And fortunately, it was a nice plowed field, and it was mountainous. So it's all mountainous in that part of the region, in both Italy, northern Italy, Croatia, and Yugoslavia. And while I was still unbuckling my chute, some local civilian came up. He had a big horse pistol in his hand. He motioned for us to follow him, and I wasn't about to argue with him, so we proceeded to follow with him. And they got 8 of us together within 4 hours. And then the pilot who was last out, we met him the next day. We were picked up by the partisans, actually. The partisans were very well organized, and so they had lines of communication as far as carriers and couriers, I should say. And the bombardier, who was the first one to jump out the back end, he pulled a delayed jump. And that's the story in itself, by the way, about what happened to him. We saw him a week later, but we eventually didn't meet up with him. And so we stayed with the partisans. That night, we thought we were going to stay overnight. They gave us a nice meal of basically lettuce. We had a nice salad, if you will, and we thought we were going to have a tremendous banquet here because the hall was filled with people there. And they motioned us outside, and then we started walking. And we walked 8 hours, all night long, if you will, until sunrise, and that time we stopped. So that was our mode of transport, walking, for the next 3 weeks. And we finally got to an area that was, a lot of people didn't realize or appreciate the fact that they had strips of liberated areas behind enemy lines. The Germans were strong in the cities and the towns, but the little villages in the backwoods areas were relatively safe, if you will. So we actually got to a place where they actually had steam-powered trucks. And we actually got a ride in a truck on a dirt road, if you will, even so, to the next destination, which was a little tiny village. And we stayed there for 2 weeks. And eventually, we met by the way, an officer from the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, that's the American Behind the Lines liaison. And they made contact with our folks, our group back in Barrie, etc. And eventually, that was a staging area too. It turned out that there were other people besides our crew that were sent to that area. And so they came in with an airplane about a week after we got there, and they took basically wounded back to Barrie. And the next weekend, fortunately it was a moonless night. That's why they came in only on moonless nights. Mm-hmm. They came down in a grass strip that was no more than 3,000 feet long and right down in the valley between the mountains. At night, the area was outlined with smudge spots so the pilot knew where to land with the C-47, which was the military version of the DC-3, and took us and some wounded back to Barrie, Italy. And so we finally came back after being down just close to 6 weeks time period, yeah. Then we were there for about, I see a few weeks in. First, we spent some time in a hospital there because we had some problems. And then a few weeks, a week or so later, we went back to our group, and they basically grounded us and prepared us to return to the United States. And so after about a total of 4 weeks' time or so, the beginning of October time period, we boarded a troop transport from Naples Harbor back to New York. It took us roughly almost 2 weeks to get to New York from them. We had 8,000 Allied returnees, if you will, and 2,000 German POWs on board. It was a big ship, and I never knew it until years later, but it turned out to be the flagship of the North German Lloyd line, the SS Europa, that was captured in port. And the name was changed to the French name Liberté. That's what I knew for years and years later. but eventually found out it was originally the SS Europa from the German North Lloyd line. And then we was given about a month's leave, and then we sent back to an organization in the Air Force which redeployed the returning troops, if you will, and they asked me what I wanted to do, etc., etc. I didn't want to fly any big aircraft anymore. B-24 is a 4-engine bomber. So they sent me to a twin-engine place called, it came in Arizona, where I towed targets in B-26s for a while, about a month or so, a month or 2 months. And then I got kind of bored being in Kingman because it was very desolate there, and I wanted to get near some action. So I saw a notice on the board for people that want to become flight instructors, which I signed up for. And so I was transferred from there down to Tucson, Arizona, and became a flight instructor there. And I spent about another half year or so instructing cadets how to fly what they call an AT-6, which is a 600 horsepower low-wing all-metal trainer. And even though I loved the Air Force and I wanted to stay in, the last experience I had there was instructing Chinese troops how to fly, Chinese pilots. They knew no English, and I knew only 2 expressions, which I won't go into right now. And it got very frustrating, and I got very tired of the whole scenario. So when there was a notice that said anybody that qualifies under these conditions can leave the service. This was right after VJ Day, by the way, in August of '45. I applied. Within a few weeks I was home. That ended my military career then.
I'm going to go back and ask a couple questions. Did you keep the same plane your whole time in the 15th?
We kept, we basically, when we first got there, we didn't fly our first mission as a crew. We were split up, so we went with an experienced crew and into about 4 or 5 different airplanes. And then the second crew, the second time we flew as a crew, right? And stayed as a crew in our same airplane all the while we were there until we got shot down, yes.
Okay, now did you decorate your plane? Did you name it? And
then the pilot, he called his wife Little One, so we called the airplane Little One. And like all the other airplanes in the group, practically everybody had a Varga girl painted on the side of the airplane. We had ours also, yes. But it was called Little One.
Did you decorate your jacket at all?
No, I didn't decorate it at all. No.
Okay. You said you flew 2 missions into Ploesti?
We flew at least 2 missions to Ploesti, that's correct.
What was that like?
Well, Ploesti was one of about 2 or 3 or 4 very heavily defended, tough targets in the 15th Air Force area. We almost gave it up after one of the missions because even though we were a replacement crew and we didn't know many people there, we just made friends with our next tent mates, if you will. And we were very close to them, but not anybody else in the organization to speak of. And we were on this one Ploesti mission when they were flying lead airplane of the whole. There were about 40 airplanes in a group that flew in formation, if you will, close together. And we were flying. They were flying lead. We were flying on the right wing of that lead airplane that they were flying. And they took a direct hit right behind the wing. I can still see it in my mind's eye. The shell exploded, and the fuselage blew up like bubble gum, and splintered and so on. The front section went down, the back end went back through the formation. We got so discombobulated, we shot in front of the whole formation and finally formed back up with the rest of the group. Came back and almost to a man decided that we weren't going to fly any more missions. And it took a little while before we changed our minds, but we came that close to saying, I don't care if you put us in the infantry or what, we're not going to fly any more missions. Yeah, that was the most scary experience I had in the whole service. Yeah.
How many missions did you fly?
Like I said, it was our 17th flight actually, and we got credit for like 26 missions, 17 sorties, 26 missions, something like that. Yeah.
Did you ever use the GI Bill when you returned home?
Yes, fortunately, it worked out very well for me because I went to a vocational high school and they had the 5220 club at the time, which meant that you could get $20 a week for 52 weeks if you couldn't find employment. And so I wanted to become a civilian pilot, and I couldn't find any employment, so I took the opportunity to go back to high school and make up all my Regents credits in New York State as far as taking physics, chemistry, 3 years of math, my Regents and history Regents, history and English Regents, and by September they opened up a college called the Associated Colleges of Upper New York State. They had a few campuses. One was up in Plattsburgh, and so at that time I was qualified with the background to take up engineering. Mm-hmm. And so it was at that time that I applied the GI Bill directly, and so I got my college education, 4 years of college, the first two up in Plattsburgh and the last two at Polytechnic Institute of Brooklyn, not in New York City, and became an aeronautical engineer as a result of that, yes.
And you went to GE, I heard you mention.
Then, well, from that point, the Korean War had just started when I graduated in 1950, and jobs were kind of tough to get at the time until the Korean War opened things up, and then I got a job working for a helicopter organization called Piasecki, which now is Vertol, Boeing Vertol, and they fly the twin rotor helicopters, one rotor in the front, one in the back. And I went into and got employed by their flight test section, which to me was a dream come true. I was in flight test engineering there for about 6 years altogether, and I had a slight accident in that time period, so I decided that wasn't for me any longer, and that's when I switched companies. Mm-hmm. I went to work for GE right up here in Schenectady at the time, yes.
Mm-hmm. Did you join, or have you ever been active in any of the veterans organizations?
I belonged to the reserves until the Korean War started. They called up the whole group at that time, but since I had been overseas and so on, there was only a few of us that were exempted from actually being taken back into active service. And then I didn't belong to any reserve group or anything after that point in time, no.
Any veterans organizations? American Legion?
Well, I belonged to the American Legion in the last, I'd say, 15 years or so. Mm-hmm. Yeah, 15 years or so.
Have you ever kept contact with anyone that you were in the service with?
Well, the bomb group has reunions every 2 years. Mm-hmm. So we went to, the last one we went to was Nashville in the September time period, and I didn't see any of my crew members at that. There's only 5 of us of the 10 remaining, by the way, but I did see most of them 2 years before them when we were in Las Vegas, Nevada, because most of them live in the West Coast area. I'm the only one east of the Mississippi. But then there's another organization I belong to called the Air Force Escape and Evasion Society, which has meetings every year, conventions every year, and I see those people from year to year. I didn't know any of them except maybe 1 or 2 in the service before, but I got to meet them and became friends with them over the years, right.
Mm-hmm. How would you say your service changed or affected your life?
Well, to me, as I was mentioned earlier, the World War II was a blessing because I realized my dreams. I wanted to become a pilot since I was 8 years old. I used to buy all these aviation magazines and think about flying all the time. And when World War II came along, I had the opportunity to become a pilot, which was beyond my wildest dreams that I would become a pilot that soon. I was thinking of becoming an aviation mechanic and work my way up, if you will. Mm-hmm. And I had this opportunity and I grabbed it, and that was just fantastic for me. And the GI Bill, I can't recommend too highly. The government spent this money, and I think they got paid back many, many fold relative to the services that we collectively provided this country. It was a blessing in disguise for this country that we took advantage of that, even though we personally benefited from it. And I thank God.
Okay, is there anything else you want to add? Or?
Offhand, I can't think of anything off right now, no.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
You're quite welcome, I'm sure.
Going. Could you describe this photograph?
That is a picture of our crew. We were pilot, co-pilot, bombardier, navigator, and we had 4 gunners and a flight engineer and a radio man who were also gunners.
Could you pick yourself out in this photograph?
Yes, I am this one right here.
Okay.
That was prior to takeoff, yeah.
Okay, now I notice you have some of the planes are aluminum, some are painted. Why?
Well, it turned out that all the aircraft initially were painted olive drab, so they would be better camouflage, if you will, but it turned out that since we were high-altitude bombers, you don't need camouflage at that altitude. In fact, the silver is better because you can't spot the silver ones in the sky as rapidly as you can the darker camouflaged aircraft, yes. And they also were less weight and a little faster as a result.
Now, who took these photographs?
The navigator on our crew, Joe Lydiak, took all those photographs. Thank God he did.
Now, this is a P-38?
That's a P-38. The first picture shows him coming into the group, and the second one shows him being peeled off, yeah.
Was that, they were fighter protection?
They were fighter cover escorts, right.
Okay, now, how about these? What is that?
These dots are, our airfield was in the middle of a wheat field, and these are clumps of wheat in the wheat field itself, and that was through the bomb bay, the doors were open.
And this is the...
These are the
picture of
bombs, bombs in the bomb racks, right.
Okay, and this is a salvo of bombs that you, what did you say?
We salvoed them. We got rid of them before we landed. We didn't want to land with a full bomb load. So we dropped them in the Adriatic Sea.
And these two photographs?
That's me in the cockpit, co-pilot, and that's me walking toward the truck returning back to our camp after the mission.
And this last.
This shows a picture of our ground crew man, and that's our airplane. You can see the girl painted on the side. And that's a picture of me taken when I was in advanced flying school. We took twin-engine trainers, and that's what that picture is.
Okay.
Did you want to see any of these?
Oh, yes. Now, these were different examples of nose art from...
This is nose art. These pictures were taken like in summer of '44, September time period, of the aircraft in our group at that time, showing different examples of nose art for the B-24s that were on our field in our group.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
You're quite welcome, I'm sure.